right here. But I'm so proud of the way that you came together, the way that you fought in that fourth quarter and those runs, the way that we came together going into overtime, coming together and finishing this game. Yes. All right, great job. That we grew today. Yep. We grew today.
Stephanie White is not going to beat the allegations. She is not going to beat them tomorrow. She is not going to beat them next week. And after what we all witnessed in that post-game press conference, after what she said, and more importantly, after what she deliberately, calculatedly, and absolutely refused to say, she is never ever going to beat them. Caitlin Clark just delivered one of the most dominant individual performances in a Fever uniform this season. A double-double, points, assists, the game-winning shot, and Stephanie White stood at that podium with cameras rolling and said absolutely nothing. Not one word, not one syllable. Caitlin Clark's name did not leave her mouth. Welcome back. This is Rum Run, and today we are documenting the most blatant, most undeniable, most inexcusable act of coaching negligence in the Indiana Fever's recent memory. And we are going to do it with receipts.
Okay, a lot of really good stuff. 19 second chance points. Okay, again, a lot of really good stuff. And most importantly, we stacked today, and we got better.
Ooh, you're right about that. We sure do know.
Let me give you the full picture before we go any further, because the stakes here are not small. The Indiana Fever just escaped, and I mean escaped, a game against the Chicago Sky. The Chicago Sky, one of the worst teams in this league right now, and I want every single person watching this video to sit with that for a second. The Fever blew a 19-point lead, 19 points, against the Sky. They let that game go so sideways, so completely off the rails, that it went to overtime, against a team they should have beaten by 22 points on a bad night. Now here is the part the establishment does not want you to focus on, the part the post-game press release is going to gloss right over. The reason the Fever survived that game, the singular, undeniable, mathematical reason they are not sitting on a loss right now, is Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark, who put up a double-double. Caitlin Clark, who was accounting for 42 points when you add up her assists and her own scoring. Caitlin Clark, who hit the shot that kept this game alive. That is the real story. And Stephanie White knows it. She just refuses to say it out loud.
The collective positivity, the collective accountability, talking each other up, that is huge, y'all. Yes, we are closing that thing. We are closing that.
Let me walk you through exactly what happened in this game, because the details are brutal, and they are traceable, and they will make your blood boil. The Chicago Sky outscored the Indiana Fever 65-46 across the second and third quarters combined. 65-46. This is a team that is supposed to have a defensive identity under Stephanie White. This is a coach who has been sold to the Fever fanbase as a defensive guru. And the Sky hung 65 points on her team in 2 quarters. 2 quarters. Against a team with no business doing that to anyone in this league right now. Aaliyah Boston put up a career-high 34 points. 34. And I want to be very clear about something here, because the narrative around that number is going to be distorted. Boston took 26 shots to get to those 34 points. 26 shots. That is not an efficient offensive performance. That is volume. That is a player who was fed the ball relentlessly, who chucked it up over and over, and who eventually accumulated a number that looks impressive on a box score, but does not tell you the whole story of how that game was managed on the offensive end. And here is the thing that should infuriate you. Caitlin Clark was on the floor. Caitlin Clark, who had just hit a game-winning shot in the previous game, a logo 3, from half-court range, the kind of shot that only a handful of players in the world can even attempt with confidence. She was right there, she was available, she was hot. And Stephanie White's offense was drawing up plays to go to Aaliyah Boston, while Caitlin Clark stood on the right side of the floor, having just proven she could win a game by herself. That is not coaching. That is not strategy. That is not a system. That is coaching malpractice. Coaching malpractice. Now let me tell you about the postgame, because this is where it gets truly, genuinely, soul-crushingly disgraceful. Stephanie White stood at that podium and she ran through her list. She talked about weathering storms, she talked about the fourth quarter runs, she mentioned Aaliyah Boston's career high, she mentioned second chance points, 19 of them. She mentioned points off turnovers, 29 of them. She talked about collective positivity. She talked about collective accountability. She talked about how the team grew that day. She was proud of them. And Caitlin Clark, the player who accounted for 42 points in that game between her scoring and her assists, the player who had a double-double, the only player alongside Aaliyah Boston to record a double-double on the night. Caitlin Clark's name did not come out of Stephanie White's mouth. Not once, not a single time. Don't take my word for it. Here is Stephanie White at the podium, in her own voice, with cameras rolling, delivering the post-game address that tells you everything you need to know about this coaching situation.
This right here. But I'm so proud of the way that you came together, the way that you fought in that fourth quarter and those runs, the way that we came together going into overtime, coming together and finishing this game. Yes. All right, great job. That we grew today. Yep. We grew today.
She said it, with cameras rolling, in front of reporters. After a game where Caitlin Clark accounted for 42 points and recorded a double-double, Stephanie White stood at that podium and talked about collective positivity and how they grew today. She mentioned Aaliyah Boston's career high. She did not mention Caitlin Clark once. Not once. Let that sink in for a second. Let that actually land, because what you just heard is not a slip. It is not an oversight. It is a pattern, and it is undeniable, and we are going to document every single layer of it right now.
Okay, a lot of really good stuff. 19 second chance points. Okay, again, a lot of really good stuff. And most importantly, we stacked today, and we got better.
Woo, you're right about that. We sure do know.
Let me start with the tactical failure, because it is glaring and it is specific and it has a name. Stephanie White had a two-man game working in that game. Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, running ball screens, running two-man actions, generating offense that the Chicago Sky had absolutely no answer for. That combination, Clark and Boston, was a well-oiled machine. Every time it was activated, it worked. It was unstoppable. The Sky could not stop it. They did not have the personnel to stop it. They did not have the scheme to stop it. It was free points every single time it ran. And what did Stephanie White do? She throttled it. She went away from it. She started feeding Boston isolation possessions instead of running the two-man game that was dismantling the Sky's defense. 26 shots for Boston. 26. That is what happens when a coach abandons the thing that is working and starts freelancing. That is what happens when there is no discipline in the offensive scheme, no commitment to the action that is generating the most efficient looks. And here is the layer on top of that which makes it worse. Caitlin Clark herself, in post-game comments, was essentially telling Stephanie White what the offense should look like. She talked about ball screens with Boston. She talked about two-man actions with Boston. She said, and I want you to hear this clearly, she said she felt like they could do a lot more of that. A lot more. The star player, the generational talent, the person who accounted for 42 points in that game, was essentially drawing up the offense in the post-game interview because the head coach was not doing it during the game. That is not a good sign. That is not a sign of a coaching staff that has its players' trust. That is a sign of a player who has figured out what works and is watching her head coach refuse to commit to it. Now let me talk about the second layer of this failure, which is the pattern, because this is not the first time. This is not an isolated incident. This is a recurring, documented, unavoidable pattern of Stephanie White either failing to deploy Caitlin Clark correctly or failing to acknowledge her contributions publicly. Think about what we know. We know that Stephanie White has been subbing Clark out on defense at moments when Clark has been making plays on that end of the floor. We know that the play was not drawn up for Clark in a late-game possession even though Clark had just hit a game-winning shot. We know that in post-game press conference after post-game press conference, Kelsey Mitchell gets the red carpet rolled out, the effusive praise, the specific acknowledgement, the deliberate spotlight, while Caitlin Clark stands in the background of the narrative. Game after game after game. And I want to be ruthlessly clear about something here. I am not saying Kelsey Mitchell is not a good player. She is. But Kelsey Mitchell is not the reason people are watching Indiana Fever games right now. Kelsey Mitchell is not the reason this franchise has the attention of the entire basketball world. Kelsey Mitchell is not the player who just accounted for 42 points and recorded a double-double while the team blew a 19-point lead and needed overtime to survive against the Chicago Sky. That was Caitlin Clark. And Stephanie White knows it. She just will not say it. Let me give you the third layer, which is the enabler problem. Because Stephanie White does not operate in a vacuum. She operates inside a franchise. And that franchise has choices to make about what kind of coaching it is willing to accept when it has a generational talent on its roster. The Indiana Fever have Caitlin Clark. Let me say that again so it actually registers. The Indiana Fever have Caitlin Clark, a Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Steph Curry hybrid, in terms of the branding, in terms of the cultural moment, in terms of what she means to the growth of this league. And the franchise is allowing a coaching situation to persist where the head coach will not acknowledge her in post-game press conferences, will not commit to the offensive actions that make her most effective, and will not draw up plays for her in late-game situations where she has just demonstrated she can win games by herself. That is a franchise problem. That is a front office problem. That is a decision that someone in that building is making, either by action or by inaction, and it is costing this team wins, and it is costing this fan base the experience of watching their best player be deployed correctly. Now let me give you the fourth layer, the cost to Caitlin Clark herself. Because this is the part that nobody on television is going to say, and it is the part that matters most.
The collective positivity, the collective accountability, talking each other up, that is huge, y'all. Yes, we are closing that thing. We are closing that.
Caitlin Clark is doing everything right. Everything. She is putting up the numbers. She is making the plays. She is hitting the shots. She is running the actions that generate the most efficient offense this team has. She is accountable. She is available. She is coachable. Coachable enough to go into a post-game interview and essentially outline the offensive system that her head coach should already be running. And in return, she is being subbed out on defense when she is making plays. She is being bypassed in late-game possessions when she has just proven she can win the game. And she is being erased from the post-game narrative by a coach who will stand at a podium and talk about collective positivity while the player who just saved her from another embarrassing loss does not get her name mentioned once. That is the cost. That is what Caitlin Clark is absorbing right now. And I want every single person watching this video to understand that the double-double she recorded in this game, the double-double that Stephanie White could not bring herself to acknowledge at that podium, that double-double was delivered in spite of the coaching situation, not because of it. And here is the second receipt. Here is Stephanie White's post-game in the moments where she is actually asked about the team's performance. And listen to what she focuses on, and listen to what she leaves out. She listed second chance points. She listed points off turnovers. She listed stacking the day. She mentioned AB's career high. No mention of Caitlin Clark. No mention of the double-double. No mention of the 42 points Clark accounted for. No mention of the fact that Clark and Boston were the only two players on the team to record a double-double on the night. That is the admission. That is the evidence. That is what the coach said with cameras rolling, and there is no spin to put on it. Now let me render the verdict, because we have documented the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming, and it points in one direction. Prediction 1. Stephanie White's job security is more fragile than the franchise wants to admit publicly. When you have a generational talent on your roster and your head coach is being asked by reporters, by credible, named reporters who are covering this team, why she does not acknowledge that player's performance in post-game press conferences, you have a coaching situation that is already in crisis. That question does not get asked unless the pattern is undeniable. That question does not get asked unless reporters in that room have noticed the same thing the fan base has noticed. And once that question is being asked publicly, the clock on that coaching tenure is ticking. Prediction 2. The two-man game between Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston is going to become impossible to suppress. It is too effective, it is too efficient. The numbers it generates are too glaring. Every time Stephanie White goes away from it, the team struggles. Every time she runs it, it works. At some point, whether it is Stephanie White's decision or whether it happens because the players force it, that action is going to become the primary offensive engine of this team. Because the alternative is watching Aaliyah Boston take 26 shots in a game they nearly lose to the worst team in the league. Prediction 3. The Kelsey Mitchell situation is going to come to a head. The argument has been made, and it is a legitimate argument, that trading Kelsey Mitchell and a first-round pick for a dominant, efficient big, the kind of player who is everything Angel Reese is supposed to be but actually delivers it, would be the beginning of genuine roster rehabilitation for this franchise. Kiki Iriafen has been mentioned in that conversation. An efficient double-double machine at the 4, who would complement what Caitlin Clark does, rather than compete with her for touches and for the coach's attention. That trade does not happen if the franchise continues to treat Kelsey Mitchell as the centerpiece of this team's identity. But the math does not support that framing anymore, and eventually the math wins. Prediction 4. The media pressure on Stephanie White is going to intensify. Christine Brennan has been asking the right questions. Why is Caitlin Clark not being acknowledged in post-game press conferences? Is there a directive somewhere that is shaping what the coach says and does not say at that podium? These are not inflammatory questions. These are legitimate journalistic questions that deserve direct answers. And the fact that they are being asked at all tells you that the conversation TV refuses to have is already happening in that press room, whether the cameras catch it or not. And here is the clip that recontextualizes everything. Here is Stephanie White in the locker room address in the moment where a real coach, a Bill Belichick, a Greg Popovich, a Phil Jackson, would be holding their players accountable for blowing a 19-point lead. Listen to the language she uses, listen to the framing, and then ask yourself whether this is the voice of a coach who is commanding that room. The collective positivity. That is what she said. The collective positivity. After blowing a 19-point lead to the Chicago Sky. After going to overtime in a game that should have been a 22-point win. After a game where her star player accounted for 42 points and recorded a double-double and still did not get her name mentioned at the podium. The collective positivity. Can you imagine Greg Popovich saying that? Can you imagine Phil Jackson standing in front of his team after they nearly lost to the worst team in the league and talking about collective positivity? That is not coaching. That is not accountability. That is therapy. And the Indiana Fever, with Caitlin Clark on their roster, cannot afford therapy. They need a coach who commands the room. They need a coach who deploys their best player correctly. They need a coach who stands at a podium after a double-double performance and says her name. Stephanie White is not that coach right now, and the evidence is documented. The timestamps are real. The post-game audio exists. She is not beating the allegations. She is not going to beat the allegations. And every single game that passes without a change, in the offensive scheme, in the play calling, in the post-game acknowledgement, is another data point in a case that is already closed. Caitlin Clark is right now, in this moment, doing exactly what a generational talent does. She is producing, she is delivering, she is putting up double-doubles and accounting for 42 points and hitting logo threes and running two-man actions that nobody in this league can stop. She is doing it in spite of a coaching situation that is failing her. She is doing it for a fan base that sees her even when the head coach refuses to say her name. She is doing it because that is who she is. Ruthless, surgical, unstoppable, and no amount of coaching negligence is going to change that. But she deserves better. This fan base deserves better. And the Indiana Fever franchise, sitting on the most important talent acquisition in the history of this league, deserves a coaching staff that understands what they have. Here is the forced choice for the comments section, and I want a real answer from you. Do you believe Stephanie White can course correct? Start running the Clark and Boston two-man game as the primary offensive action? Stop subbing Clark out on defense when she is making plays, and start acknowledging her by name in post-game press conferences? Or is the damage already done and this franchise needs to make a move at head coach before the season gets away from them completely? That is the question. Coach stays and adjusts, or coach goes and the Fever bring in someone who understands the assignment? Drop your answer below. If this video gave you the receipts you needed, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Because we are going to keep documenting this situation every single time there is new evidence to put on the table. This is Rim Run. We will see you in the next one.